Emily thought she had everything she ever wanted: a steady marriage, comfortable home, and a husband who loved her in his quiet, practical way. For 11 years, life with Daniel had been calm and predictable. They had built a routine that worked: morning coffee together, quick kisses before work, dinner at the same time every evening. It was peaceful, yes, but that peace had slowly turned into silence. The spark that once made her heart race had faded into habit. They still cared for each other, but somewhere along the way, excitement had turned into comfort, and comfort had turned into distance. She noticed it more lately: how Daniel's eyes stayed fixed on his phone during dinner, how their conversations were mostly about bills, work, or errands. He wasn't cruel. He was just distracted. Life had become a checklist. And Emily couldn't remember the last time she felt something real, something that made her heart move faster than Ryan arrived. He joined her marketing firm as a consultant, brought in to help with a new campaign. From the first day, he seemed different from everyone else: confident, funny, and always present. The kind of man who looked at people, not through them. He had that easy charm that made others comfortable. Emily noticed how he made even the dullest meetings feel lighter. When he spoke, he made people listen. But what unsettled her most was how easily he made her laugh. At first, it was just polite conversation. "You've been here a long time, right?" he asked one morning while they waited for a presentation to start. She nodded, smiling. 11 years, she said. "You must really love it here," he grinned. "Or maybe you're just too loyal to leave." It was a harmless joke, but the way he said it, with warmth in his voice, made her feel seen in a way she hadn't felt in a long time. Days passed, and their interactions became more natural. They started working on projects together, often staying late in the office. He'd make small talk, ask about her hobbies, her weekend plans, her favorite music. She found herself telling him things she hadn't even mentioned to Daniel in years, about how she used to paint, how she dreamed of traveling to Italy, how she sometimes felt invisible. Ryan listened. He didn't rush to fix anything. He just listened. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the city's skyline, they found themselves alone in the office kitchen. The hum of the vending machine was the only sound. Ryan leaned against the counter, his voice softer than usual. "Do you ever feel like you stopped living for yourself?" he asked. The question hit her unexpectedly. She froze, unsure how to answer. It was such a simple question. Yet it felt like someone had opened a window inside her chest. She smiled awkwardly, brushing it off. "I think that's just part of getting older." But his eyes stayed on her, calm and steady. "Maybe," he said. "Or maybe it's what happens when we forget what made us feel alive in the first place." That night, Emily sat in her car before driving home. She stared at her reflection in the rearview mirror. Tired eyes, faint smile lines, the same woman Daniel saw every day. But for the first time in a long time, she wondered if there was more to her than this version she had become. She thought about Ryan's question again. "Stopped living for yourself?" The words looped in her mind like a quiet song she couldn't turn off when she walked into her house. Daniel was sitting on the couch watching a show. He smiled briefly. "Long day?" he asked. "Yeah," she said softly. She wanted to tell him about her day, about how she'd stayed late, about Ryan's question, but the words stuck in her throat. Instead, she went upstairs, changed into her pajamas, and sat by the window. Watching the streetlights flicker, she wasn't falling for Ryan. Not yet. What she felt was something deeper, something confusing. It wasn't attraction. It was awakening. It was the feeling of being noticed again, of being asked questions that made her think, that made her feel. She didn't know whether to be grateful or guilty. The next morning at work, she tried to keep her distance. She avoided looking his way during the meeting, tried to remind herself that she was married, that this sudden emotional spark didn't mean anything. But when Ryan passed her a file and smiled, saying, "You always make things easier around here," her heart betrayed her. A simple compliment, but it made her blush. She caught herself smiling long after he'd walked away. The day moved quickly. And by evening, Emily felt exhausted, not from work, but from the battle going on inside her. She didn't want to feel this way. She didn't want to admit that a man she barely knew had stirred something she thought was gone. That night, as she and Daniel had dinner, she noticed how quiet the house felt again. The only sound was the clinking of forks against plates. She looked across the table at her husband, who was scrolling through his phone. She wanted to talk to tell him about the emptiness, about how lonely love can sometimes feel even when you're not alone. But she stayed silent. Later, as she lay in bed, Daniel asleep beside her, Emily stared at the ceiling. Her mind wandered to the office, to the way Ryan's eyes held sincerity when he talked, to how his words seemed to pull emotions out of her that she'd buried under years of routine. She hated herself a little for it. Not because she had done anything wrong, but because she felt something she hadn't expected to feel again. The simple joy of being noticed, of being understood. The next morning she looked at herself in the mirror again before leaving for work. Her reflection looked the same brown hair, same tired eyes, but something inside her was different now. She couldn't name it, but she could feel it. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was longing. Or maybe it was the beginning of something that could either wake her up or break her completely as she drove to work. Her heart felt restless. She knew she was standing at the edge of something she didn't plan for. Something that both scared and excited her. She wasn't chasing it, but she couldn't ignore it either. When she walked into the office, Ryan was already there, sipping coffee and looking over papers. He looked up, smiled, and said, "Morning." Emily, she smiled back before she could stop herself. In that small moment, simple, harmless, yet charged with something unspoken, Emily realized that her life was no longer as still as it used to be. Something had shifted inside her. She didn't know where it would lead, but she knew this much. Ryan had made her feel something new, and she wasn't sure she could pretend she didn't. It started with small things, short chats during coffee breaks, shared smiles across meeting rooms, and jokes that made long work days a little lighter. Emily didn't realize how easily Ryan had become a part of her day until she caught herself looking forward to seeing him. What began as polite conversation slowly turned into something deeper. Quiet moments that felt personal. Words that seemed to mean more than they should, at first. They talked about work, campaign ideas, deadlines, clients, but soon the topics shifted. Ryan asked about her favorite books, the music she liked, the places she wanted to visit. He had a way of listening that made her feel like every word mattered. One afternoon, while they waited for a presentation to start, he said, "You ever think about what you'd do if you could start over?" She thought for a moment and answered softly, "I'd paint again. I used to love it." He smiled. "Then why don't you?" She laughed. "Life got busy." He leaned forward. "Then maybe it's time to make it unbusy." That conversation stuck with her. It wasn't that Ryan said anything extraordinary. It was how he made her feel when he said it. Heard, seen, important. Emily hadn't felt that in a long time. Their lunches together became routine. Sometimes they'd talk about their dreams, sometimes about nothing at all. Ryan shared stories from his past, the cities he'd worked in, the mistakes he'd made, the lessons he'd learned. Emily found herself telling him things she'd never said out loud. There was no judgment, no pressure, just honesty. And that honesty felt addictive. But guilt started creeping in quietly. Emily began to notice how she smiled when Ryan texted her, how her heart raced when she saw his name on her screen. She told herself it was just friendship, that it was harmless. But deep down she knew she was crossing an invisible line. At night, when Daniel sat beside her watching TV, she caught herself thinking about the way Ryan's voice softened when he talked to her. It made her feel alive again. And that feeling scared her. One evening, after a long day, Emily was scrolling through her phone when a message from Ryan appeared. "I like who you are when you talk to me." The words were simple, yet they hit her like a wave. She read them over and over. For years, she had been a wife, a coworker, someone reliable. But with Ryan, she felt like herself, the version of Emily she thought she'd lost somewhere along the way. The next morning, she woke up earlier than usual. As she poured her coffee, Daniel walked into the kitchen, still half asleep. "You're up early," he said. She smiled faintly. "Yeah, just couldn't sleep." He nodded and went on making breakfast. The silence between them was comfortable but distant, the kind of silence that comes when two people forget how to talk about what matters. At work, Ryan noticed something was off. "You're quiet today," he said as they sat in the cafeteria. She shrugged. "Just tired." He tilted his head. "Or maybe you're thinking too much." Ski gave him a small smile. "Maybe both." He looked at her for a moment and said softly, "Whatever it is, you don't have to carry it alone." His words warmed her, but also made her uneasy. She didn't want him to care too much, and she didn't want herself to care at all, yet she did. Every small gesture from him felt like a spark in a place that had long gone cold. Days passed, and their connection deepened without either of them admitting it. They started texting outside of work, funny memes, little updates, random thoughts at odd hours. Nothing inappropriate, but everything emotional. Ryan's messages often ended with lines like, "Take care of yourself," or "You deserve good things." Simple words, but they made her feel special in ways she hadn't felt in years. Emily tried to pull back. She avoided lunch with him, took her breaks at different times, focused on her work. But distance didn't help. It only made her think about him more. She missed their talks, his jokes, the comfort of his presence. When he noticed her withdrawal, he didn't push. He just said, "I'll be around if you need me." That kindness broke her a little. At home, Daniel started to notice changes too. She was distracted, quieter, often lost in thought. "Everything okay?" he asked one night. "Yeah," she replied quickly. "Just work." But her voice didn't sound convincing, even to herself. Daniel didn't question further. Maybe he didn't want to. One evening, Emily stayed late at work. The office was quiet, most of the lights dimmed. She sat at her desk, trying to finish a report when Ryan walked over. "You shouldn't be here this late," he said gently. She smiled tiredly. "I could say the same to you." He leaned on her desk. "Maybe I just wanted to see if you'd finally go home." She laughed softly. For a moment, it felt like the world outside didn't exist. No responsibilities, no guilt, no labels. Just a people in a quiet office. Caught in a moment that felt too natural, he handed her a coffee and said, "You know, you're allowed to want more than just comfort, Emily." She froze. "What do you mean?" "I mean," he said carefully, "it's okay to want to feel something real again. Life's too short to stop feeling." Her heart tightened. She knew he wasn't just talking about life. He was talking about them. And that terrified her. She stood up, trying to change the subject. "I should go," she said quickly. "It's late." He nodded, but didn't move. "You deserve happiness," he whispered as she walked past him. She didn't look back, but those words followed her all the way home. That night, Emily lay awake, staring at the ceiling. Her thoughts wouldn't stop spinning. She wasn't doing anything wrong, yet she knew her heart was drifting somewhere it shouldn't. She missed the way Daniel used to look at her, used to listen. But now, the space between them felt too wide. Ryan had stepped into that space, filling it with warmth and attention. Things she hadn't realized she'd been starving for. The next morning, she tried to act normal. She kissed Daniel goodbye, drove to work, greeted her team with a smile. But when she saw Ryan across the room, her heart reacted before her mind could stop it. Their eyes met briefly, and in that silent exchange, everything they weren't saying became clear. Emily knew this connection was dangerous, not because it was wrong, but because it was real. It was emotional, not physical, yet it was strong enough to shake everything she thought she knew about love and loyalty. She didn't know where it was going or how to stop it. All she knew was that her life was no longer simple. That night, as she closed her laptop, Ryan's last message glowed on her phone. "Sometimes the heart wakes up before the mind is ready." She stared at it for a long time, feeling the truth in every word. For the first time in years, Emily felt alive, and that scared her more than anything. It was a Friday evening when everything came to a breaking point. The office was quiet. Most of the team had already left to start their weekends. Emily stayed behind, finishing up a report that was due Monday. Rain tapped gently against the windows, turning the city lights outside into a blur of color. She felt restless, distracted, her thoughts drifting between the words on the screen and the conversation she had avoided all week. The one with Ryan. He appeared at her desk just as she was about to pack up. "You're still here?" he asked softly, holding his jacket over one arm. She smiled faintly, trying to get ahead before Monday. He nodded, walking closer. "You've worked enough. Let me drive you home. It's pouring outside." She hesitated, knowing she should say no, but the thought of sitting in traffic alone in the rain felt heavier than it should. "Okay," she said quietly. The ride was quiet at first. The rain grew heavier, drumming against the car roof, creating a rhythm that filled the silence between them. Streetlights glowed gold through the misty windows. Emily watched the city pass by, people rushing under umbrellas, headlights reflecting on wet roads. It all looked distant, almost dreamlike. Ryan finally spoke. "You've been avoiding me." She looked down at her hands. "I just needed some space," she said. "Why?" he asked. "Because this. Whatever this is, it's confusing." He sighed, eyes on the road. "I didn't mean to make things complicated. I just care about you, Emily, more than I probably should." Her heart clenched at his honesty. She turned to face him. "You don't understand. I have a husband, a life. I can't feel this way." Ryan's voice softened. "I'm not asking you to leave your life. I just don't want you to forget what it feels like to be alive. To be you again." Those words struck deep. She had spent months feeling half awake, moving through days that all looked the same. But with Ryan, things felt vivid, real. Still, she knew it couldn't go on. "You make it sound simple," she whispered. "It's not." They pulled up in front of her house, the rain still falling hard. The soft glow from her living room window reminded her of the life she was supposed to be content with, a life she had built with Daniel, filled with safety and quiet love. Ryan didn't reach for her or say anything more. He just looked at her, his expression a mix of sadness and understanding. "Emily," he said quietly, "you deserve to feel something that makes your heart beat again, even if it's not with me." The sincerity in his voice made her chest ache. She wanted to say something, to thank him, to stop him from saying more, but no words came. The silence between them was heavy, full of everything they couldn't say out loud. When she finally opened the door, the sound of rain grew louder. She stepped out slowly, her coat getting wet almost instantly. Ryan leaned slightly toward her window. "Take care of yourself," he said. She nodded, closing the door gently, then stood on the sidewalk watching his car disappear into the rainy night as she walked to her front door. Emily's heart felt like it was carrying two different lives. One she had lived for years, and one that had only existed in brief glances and conversations. When she entered the house, Daniel was in the kitchen making tea. He smiled when he saw her. "You're soaked. Why didn't you take an umbrella?" "I forgot," she said softly. Her voice sounded distant even to her own ears. She took the cup he offered, her fingers brushing his for a second. He didn't notice the tremble in her hand. That night, Emily sat by the window in her bedroom, watching the rain slide down the glass. Her reflection stared back at her, the same face, but something behind her eyes had changed. She thought about Ryan's words, "You deserve to feel alive." She didn't know if she agreed, or if she was angry that he'd said them out loud. Maybe both. But what she did know was that he had forced her to see herself differently, not as someone's wife or coworker, but as a woman who still had emotions buried deep under years of calm routine. The next day, work felt strange without him. Ryan had taken the weekend off for a trip, and his absence echoed through the office in small ways. No coffee waiting in the break room. No messages checking in. No kind glances across the table. Emily tried to focus on her work, but her thoughts wandered on Sunday morning. She sat in the garden with a cup of tea, surrounded by quiet. Daniel was fixing something in the garage. The smell of rain still lingered in the air. Emily opened her sketchbook for the first time in years. She picked up a pencil and began to draw simple lines at first, then shapes, then color. The motion felt awkward but freeing. With every stroke, she felt a little closer to the part of herself she'd forgotten. By the time Daniel came over, she was lost in her sketch. "I didn't know you still drew," he said, surprised. She smiled faintly. "I used to a long time ago." He looked at her with a softness she hadn't seen in years. "You should keep doing it," he said simply. His words were kind, but they didn't hit her the way Ryan's did. Not because they lacked meaning, but because they lacked the spark of discovery. Yet, for the first time, Emily didn't feel angry about it. She realized she didn't need Ryan to give her permission to feel alive. He had already reminded her what that felt like, and that was enough. The following week, Ryan returned. When Emily saw him, her heart fluttered for a moment, but she quickly steadied herself. He smiled when their eyes met, but there was a quiet understanding there now. Neither of them mentioned the car ride or what had been said. It was as if they both knew it had reached its end. A few days later, Ryan told her he was taking another job out of state this time. "It's a good opportunity," he said. "I think it's time for a change." Emily nodded. "You'll do great," she replied, her voice calm. He smiled. "You will too, you know." They didn't hug. They didn't make promises to stay in touch. They just stood there, two people who had found something important in each other, not love, but awakening. That evening, as Emily drove home, she felt both heavy and free. Heavy because of what could have been, and free because she had finally understood what she truly needed, not escape, but reconnection. When she got home, Daniel was in the kitchen again. He looked up from the stove. "You're smiling," he said. She hadn't realized she was. "Yeah," she whispered. "I think I just remembered something I'd forgotten." That night, as she lay beside him, Emily felt peaceful. She didn't need Ryan's presence to remind her of her worth anymore. He had been a mirror, reflecting back the parts of herself she'd stopped seeing. The chapter with him had closed, quietly, but completely. Outside, the rain had stopped. The world felt still again, but this time it wasn't empty. It was calm in a new way, as if life was waiting for her to begin again. The days after Ryan left felt strange for Emily. The office was quieter, slower, and though everything looked the same, it didn't feel the same. She kept busy answering emails, working through projects, drinking her morning coffee at her desk, just as before. But deep down, something inside her had shifted. She was no longer waiting for a message, no longer wondering if she'd run into him by the elevator. It was over, yet his words still echoed in her mind. "You deserve to feel alive at first." She tried to ignore the ache he left behind. But as the days turned into weeks, she began to see his absence differently. Not as emptiness, but as space. Space to think, to breathe, to rediscover who she was before life became routine. Ryan had stirred something in her, and though it had hurt, it also awakened her. One evening, while Daniel was in the living room watching television, Emily sat on the back porch with a sketch pad in her lap. The sunset painted the sky in shades of gold and pink, and for the first time in years, she felt at peace. She started sketching again, her garden, the trees, the quiet sky. It wasn't perfect, but it was hers. When Daniel stepped outside and saw her drawing, he looked surprised. "You're painting again?" he asked. She nodded, smiling. "I guess I missed it." He stood beside her for a moment, watching her sketch. "You seem different lately," he said. "Better." Emily paused, thinking. "I'm trying to be," she admitted. There was no sadness in her voice, just honesty. Daniel nodded slowly, his expression softening. "I'm glad," he said quietly. Their conversation started changing after that night. Instead of short exchanges about bills or chores, they began to talk again. Really talk. About their early years together, about how comfortable they'd both become, about the distance that had slowly crept between them. For the first time, Daniel admitted he'd noticed it too. "I thought maybe you just didn't need me the same way anymore," he said. Emily looked at him, her voice gentle. "It's not that I didn't need you. I just forgot how to reach you." Those words opened something between them. They didn't fix everything overnight, but they began to rebuild slowly, honestly. Emily didn't tell Daniel about Ryan, not directly. There was no reason to. What mattered was what that experience had taught her. that love can fade if you stop tending to it. That connection doesn't survive on habit alone. Over the next few months, life began to feel different. Emily started taking small steps toward herself again. She joined an art class at a local studio, met new people, and rediscovered the quiet joy of creating something from nothing. She came home with paint stains on her fingers and a light in her eyes that Daniel hadn't seen in years. One evening, after dinner, Daniel handed her a wrapped package. "What's this?" she asked, curious. "Just open it," he said with a grin. Inside was a new set of brushes and a small easel. "You said you wanted to paint again," he said shyly. "I thought maybe this would help." Emily's eyes filled with tears, not because of the gift itself, but because he had noticed. He was paying attention again. She hugged him, and for the first time in a long time, it didn't feel like routine. It felt real. Still, there were moments when Ryan crossed her mind, a scent in the air, song on the radio, the way the rain looked against the window. But instead of guilt or longing, she felt gratitude. He hadn't taken her away from her life. He had given her back to herself. Sometimes people enter your world not to stay, but to remind you of something you've forgotten. Months later, Emily walked into her office to find that Ryan had sent a group email, a short note saying he'd started his new position in Seattle and was grateful for his time working with everyone. It was polite, professional, and brief. But when she read it, she smiled. It was closure, gentle, and final. That night, she told Daniel about it. "Remember that consultant who worked with us last year?" she asked casually. "He got a job in Seattle." Daniel nodded. Good for him. There was no jealousy, no tension, just calm. Emily smiled. "Yeah," she said softly. "Good for him." As time passed, Emily and Daniel's marriage grew stronger. Not perfect, but more real. They went for walks again, cooked dinner together, and sometimes just sat in silence. Not the cold silence of before, but a comfortable one. Emily realized that love wasn't about constant excitement or newness. It was about choosing to keep finding each other. Even after years of losing touch in the noise of life. One rainy afternoon, Emily stood by the window watching raindrops trail down the glass. For a moment, it reminded her of that night in Ryan's car. The same sound, the same stillness. But this time, her heart didn't ache. She smiled softly, whispering to herself, "I feel alive." She went back to her studio and picked up her brush, adding color to a canvas that showed a woman standing in the rain, not lost, not broken, just thoughtful. It was her favorite painting she'd done in years, not because it was perfect, but because it felt true. Later, Daniel walked in and stood beside her, his arm brushing against hers. "That's beautiful," he said quietly. "She looks like she's finally found something." Emily smiled. "Maybe she did," she replied. As evening settled in, Jill looked around their home, the soft light, the warmth of shared laughter, quiet companionship that had returned between them. It wasn't the same as the early years of their love. It was deeper, steadier, earned. That night, as they sat on the couch watching the rain, Daniel reached for her hand. It was a small gesture, but it meant everything. Emily leaned her head on his shoulder, feeling the calm that comes when life finally makes sense again, in that quiet moment. She thought of Ryan one last time, not as the man she almost fell for, but as the reminder she needed. He had shown her that numbness isn't peace, that love without attention fades, and that sometimes the most important person you need to rediscover is yourself. The next morning, Emily opened the window to let in the fresh air. The rain had stopped and sunlight spilled across the floor. She smiled as she got ready for work, feeling grounded and whole. She had faced temptation, confusion, and truth, and come out stronger, wiser, more alive. As she walked out the door, she whispered to herself, "I finally feel something new." But this time, it wasn't because of anyone else. It was because she had chosen to. And for Emily, that was the most honest kind of love there was.